Indigenous peoples have been resisting colonization and domination for centuries. Long before today's modern international order, indigenous peoples were participating in wars, trading and concluding treaties with states, and governing themselves as sovereign entities. The United Nations was formed in 1945 when World War II ended. The start of the UN era saw an acceleration of indigenous peoples' involvement and visibility at the international level, and with time, the creation of an international indigenous peoples movement. Why? Because for the first time in history, human rights were recognized in Article 1 of the UN Charter as a matter of international concern. Since then, the individual human being and slowly groups were elevated into subjects of international law, and their human rights became matters that the state is accountable for. This online course discusses the actions and achievements of indigenous peoples through the UN system in the post-1945 era. Many indigenous leaders saw a potential that opened up to seek justice at international level while continuing grassroots and national efforts. After the Second World War, we can distinguish two main periods in the relation between indigenous peoples and states, as well as the indigenous peoples and the international organizations established by states, especially the United Nations. I use the term interstate system instead of the usual intergovernmental system to describe the UN, for example, because indigenous peoples have governments as well. The first period of the indigenous peoples movement, 1945 to 1993, is characterized by the building of the first international normative foundations on indigenous peoples' rights. And the second period, 1994 to the present, is defined by the establishment of international monitoring policy and programming institutions. While you will find in your bibliography a chronology of milestones in the interface between indigenous peoples and the United Nations, I would like to highlight a few of these that will guide our understanding. For the first period, 45 to 93, the first indigenous issues that drew international attention were anti-slavery and anti-forced labor. In 1957, the International Labour Organization, the ILO, began investigating the forced labor of native populations, the language that was used at the time, and adopted Convention number 107, the Indigenous and Tribal Populations Convention. While Convention number 107 was meant to bring positive change in the area of labor, it was later correctly characterized as assimilationist by indigenous peoples and was eventually updated by the International Labour Convention in 1989 with Convention number 169. Indigenous peoples were inspired by the decolonization movement that was flourishing in the 1960s and 1970s, bringing a score of newly independent states to the international community and creating new dynamics in international politics. The civil rights movement and social justice struggles around the world were other sources of inspiration for indigenous peoples. For example, Native Americans became more directly involved with the civil rights movement in the United States. This and other similar struggles framed the nascent international indigenous peoples movement in human rights terms. In 1972, the UN Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities launched a landmark study on, quote, the problem of discrimination against indigenous populations, unquote. Rather than the usual interstate approach, this study included a diverse range of indigenous peoples' input. This was a new methodology, revolutionary at the time, that brought the voice of indigenous peoples to the table. We acknowledge here the contributions of the late Don Augusto Williamson Diaz, the person in charge of the study in the UN Secretariat and the first one to work on indigenous rights at the United Nations. Despite political challenges he faced, Williamson Diaz fought for and facilitated indigenous peoples' input in the study. One could say that the new methodology catalyzed a plethora of UN-related actions, opening this global organization to indigenous peoples. In 1977, a non-governmental organizations conference on indigenous peoples was held at the UN in Geneva, attended by indigenous representatives of the Western Hemisphere. It produced the Declaration of Principles for the Defense of the Indigenous Nations and Peoples of the Western Hemisphere that created the foundations of what became later the historic UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a major focus of this course and a living document for indigenous peoples. This was followed in 1981 by the first global meeting of indigenous peoples in Geneva and opened up the door for the establishment of new mechanisms of the United Nations. 1982 was a landmark year. The study of the problem of discrimination against indigenous populations was first launched in 82 and published in volumes from 82 to 84. It is the most voluminous UN study and one that took the longest to complete. It is now available on the website of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Because of its historic significance, I highly encourage you to go and familiarize yourself with this study. It was evident that something important had to follow the study of the problem of discrimination against indigenous populations. 1982 also saw the establishment of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, the first ever indigenous-specific UN body, composed of 5 experts with a mandate to, quote, review recent developments regarding the human rights of indigenous populations, and secondly, to develop international standards. Then, in an unprecedented breakthrough in 1983, the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations decided to allow direct participation in its work by representatives of indigenous communities, even those without consultative status, the standard UN requirement for NGO participation. Of course, many indigenous representatives would not call themselves NGOs. From 15 NGOs participating in the working group in 1982, when we come to 1983, and later today, almost 1,000 and sometimes close to 2,000 indigenous representatives participate at UN indigenous-related bodies, as we will explain later in the course. In 1985, the General Assembly established the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Populations. At that time, the fund assisted indigenous grassroots organizations to travel to Geneva to be part of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations. This fund still exists today and funds indigenous participation in many more bodies. Its name has been revised to the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. Given that it's not uncommon for indigenous peoples to bring up violations of their rights when they come to the UN, it may appear as a paradox that states have not only allowed special processes for this participation, but have also established a fund to facilitate it. This is just one example of how the UN becomes something larger than its constituent parts, the states that compose it, and it rises to the level of its founding principles. As we discussed earlier on our timeline, the ILO, International Labour Organization, adopted ILO Convention 107 in 1957 as a countermeasure against slavery and forced labor. In 1989, the ILO received mounting criticism from the indigenous peoples movement, urging the organization to update Convention 107. It was updated indeed to Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples, that in addition to labor rights, recognizes more clearly land rights and cultural rights, including traditional legal systems. ILO Convention 169 is the only international treaty on indigenous peoples' rights. However, ratification remains low, 22 countries to date. 1993 was also a landmark year. The UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations completed a draft declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. At this time, it was drafted with the unprecedented participation and expressed aspirations of indigenous peoples with little participation from states. 1993 was also proclaimed International Year of the World's Indigenous People, quote, to strengthen international cooperation for the solution of problems faced by indigenous communities in areas such as human rights, the environment, development, education, and health, unquote. Rigoberta Menchú, the Guatemalan indigenous leader, was named Goodwill Ambassador for the International Year by the UN Secretary General. Rigoberta Menchú symbolized the resistance of the Maya people against the genocide and crimes against humanity committed against them during the time of Rios Montt's dictatorship in the 1980s. Menchú received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. This same year, the UN World Conference on Human Rights also recommended that the General Assembly establish a permanent forum for indigenous issues in the UN system, since the working group was not a permanent body and did not occupy a high position in the hierarchy of UN bodies. This idea of establishing a permanent forum would not be fully actualized until the year 2000, which brings us onto the second period of the indigenous peoples movement from 94 to the present day. The landmark year of 1993 opened the possibility of actually adopting international standards on indigenous peoples' rights, of actually creating monitoring mechanisms for indigenous peoples' rights, and pushing for indigenous-related policies in the development agenda and all agendas of the United Nations. For example, the first international decade of the world's indigenous people was proclaimed by the UN from 1994 to 2004. It was subsequently followed by the second decade from 2005 to 2015. In 1996, another working group was established at the Commission on Human Rights to continue discussions on the draft declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, with more political input by states this time. The year 2000 sees the establishment of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The Permanent Forum is a high-level body with a unique composition of 16 members, 8 nominated by states and 8 nominated by indigenous peoples themselves, sitting at a level of equality and a broad mandate. We will discuss the Permanent Forum throughout this course, but especially in Module 5. In 2001, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was established. The UN Special Rapporteur monitors human rights and fundamental freedoms on an international level. The UN Special Rapporteur reports on the overall human rights situation of indigenous peoples and addresses violations of indigenous peoples' rights. And after more than 25 years of negotiations since the start of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, in 2007, the UN General Assembly finally adopted the historic UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a document that indigenous peoples hold in high esteem because of their active and direct involvement in its creation. This declaration has historic, moral, and legal significance, and we will be discussing it throughout this course. In the year 2008, the Human Rights Council created the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which we will cover in depth in Module 5. The expert mechanism advises the Council through the preparation of studies and country analysis. And in 2014, the UN held a World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Among its positive outcomes, the World Conference, a global consensus document of heads of state or government, ministers, and other high officials, reaffirmed support for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and states commitments made in this respect to consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them in accordance with the applicable principles of the Declaration. The outcome document, which is in your bibliography, also included provisions on indigenous women, children, youth, and persons with disability, cultural rights, well-being and development, private sector, extractive industries and mega projects, and needed reforms in the UN system. The year 2019 was declared by the United Nations as the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and an International Decade of Indigenous Languages will start in the year 2022. There are high expectations that these impressive achievements on indigenous peoples' rights at the normative and institutional level internationally will result in positive changes on the ground, improving the sustainability and well-being of indigenous peoples' communities.